Buenos días, chicos, ¿cómo están? Bueno, yo estoy muy bien esta mañana. Entonces, I hope that you guys are good. Bien, muy bien. Este video is going to be a review sobre los verbos que terminan en IR. I'm going to try and do this so that it's nice and comprehensive with my paper supplements to help us out. One of our lessons did a recent speaking and writing assignment is talking about IR verbs. Escribir, to write. Decidir, to decide. Vivir, to live. All of those verbs are IR verbs, and when they are when they're the IR verb, when they're finished, when they end in the IR, that is called their infinitive form, and that definitely means that they include the to in it. To write, to decide, to live, when they're not conjugated. So when you have an IR on the end, or an AR, if we were talking about AR verbs, those are the infinitive forms and they are not conjugated. Entonces, how do we talk about things that I do or things that you do when I write or you write? We need to conjugate our verbs. So, our example con escribir, to write, when I say I write, yo escribo. That O on the end is indicative of first person, I do it. Tú escribes. That ES on the end, that S and that ES is indicative of something that you do. And this is a pattern that we see with all of our verbs, whether it's an AR verb, an IR verb, or an ER verb, which I don't think we've gotten to yet, but maybe we have. All of our verbs are going to follow this pattern. So O on the end is I do it. Yo escribo. I do it. Tú escribes. You write. What about third person? Ella escribe, she writes. Él escribe, he writes. What about Tom or Sonia escribe? He or she writes. And that is a pattern that always stays the same as well. Only the E. Only the E on the end there. What about something that we all do? Todos. Todos. Me and you. Everybody together does something. Nosotros. Nosotros escribimos. What if it's something that they do? Tom y Sonia escriben. Escriben. And this is something that's interesting because these patterns, that imos, what if we didn't even have nosotros? What if we didn't even include the pronoun? If we saw escribimos and there was no nosotros there, that imos, al fin, at the end, tells us automatically that it's talking about everybody. We. What about here? If we didn't have ellos, we would automatically know, based on our ending, that en, that it was a plural person, more than one person, but not including yourself. Hacemos otro. We'll do another one. Vivir. That IR automatically tells us that it's in the infinitive form, and that IR, vivir, means the to. That automatically tells us that it means to live. Vivir, to live. Alright. First person singular. Yo. Yo. Yo vivo en Missoula. Now, why do I have the yo in parentheses? It's because, once again, we don't really even need it. It's optional. It's for emphasis. I could simply say vivo en Missoula, and that O on the end is automatically going to tell me that it's talking about first person singular. Yo vivo en Missoula. It's optional, because without it, that O still tells us who the subject is. Tú vives en Montana. You live in Montana. You do live in Montana. Otra vez. The tú is optional. Without that tú, you still know that that ES on the end indicates second person. Second person. Tú vives in Montana. What about él, ella, Tom, or Sonia? Vive in Mexico. So we're seeing a pattern, just like with our example de escribir. Escribe, vive, is only just a E on the end. There's no S, there's no O, there's no N. It's just the one vowel. Now this third person singular, I still had in parentheses down here for our subject, but this one is not quite as optional as the other ones. It's because without a little bit more information of our subject pronouns, we don't know for sure if it's Tom, or if it's Sonia, or if it's a girl or a boy, because they all have the same ending. So it is optional, but it's more advisable that we include the pronouns and the names so that we know exactly which third person we're talking about. All of us live in Montana, and all of us, nosotros, todos nosotros, yo y tú, we live in Montana and los Estados Unidos. Entonces, nosotros vivimos en los Estados Unidos. So once again, vivir, unconjugated in the infinitive form, means to live. But we need to conjugate it when we're talking about specific subjects. So, vivimos en los Estados Unidos. All of us, we live in the United States. Once again, nosotros, it's opcional, it's optional. Because without that word, that literally, el pronombre, without the pronoun, vivimos, imos tells us that it's nosotros. And this will be the same for all of our verbs. Even if it's an AR verb, it's still going to have the MOS on the end. It would just be amos instead of imos. So that is a nice thing, that MOS always means nosotros. Here we go, back on the bottom. Plural, third person. They live in Mexico. Ellos viven en Mexico. Tom and Sonia live in Mexico. Tom y Sonia viven en Mexico. So once again, that third person, this is optional, but it's less optional than the other ones because we don't know if we're talking about girls that only live in Mexico or boys or exactly who. So we do need a little bit more information with those. Let's see here, what else do I have for you? Oh, aquí es un ejemplo. Here's an example of why you do have to conjugate your verbs. In some of our exercises that I've been grading, whether it's been written or oral, some students have been not conjugating their verbs. So, we know that vivir means to live, and if you don't conjugate it, and you're talking about something that you do, this is what if you didn't conjugate it, yo vivir in Montana, the translation would sound like I to live in Montana, instead of I live in Montana. So if you don't conjugate your sentences, it gets translated with that to in it, and it doesn't make sense. Yo vivir in Montana. If you said that to me, and you included a subject pronoun, I would know what you meant, and a native speaker would understand you more or less, but you do need to conjugate your verbs. Let's see here. Here is a rundown of the chart of what it looks like. Vivir, to live. Yo vivo. Tú vives. Él, ella vive. Nosotros vivimos. Ellos viven. So this side here is singular side. The subjects are I, you, he or she. And then the other side here is the plural side. So it's first, nosotros is first person plural, and this is third person plural. Here we have first person singular, second person singular, and third person singular. So here's a pattern, and this is something that we're going to see over and over and over again. So there's not much we can do other than practice and just really memorize that yo has an O at the end, tú has an E or an S, always an S. So whether it's an ES or an AS, if you're talking about an AR verb, but that tú always has an S on the end. Nosotros, MOS, always. Nosotros, we. ellos, ellas, the third person plural, always has an N on the S. Excuse me, an N on the end. Whether it's an AR verb, it would be hablan or viven. So N always means that it's third person plural. Hope that helps. I'll get better at making videos that are hopefully less manual with my paper and more computer oriented with some screenshots from a Word document perhaps. But I sure hope that you understood that, and we'll just keep practicing. Entonces, adios chicos.